Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching Today I Found Out, and in the video today, driving over anti-tank guns, the remarkable Russian KV tanks. The KV-1 and the KV-2 are recognized as being amongst the most heavily armored tanks deployed during World War II. At least initially, they were largely impervious to anything less than a direct point-blank hit from a dedicated anti-tank weapon. The KV series, it was indeed so formidable that the first time the Wehrmacht encountered them, Soviet soldiers destroyed dozens of anti-tank guns by simply driving towards them in a straight line and running over them. Introduced in 1939 and named for famed Soviet officer Kliment Voroshilov, a man who once personally tried to attack a German tank division with a pistol, the KV series was designed to replace the T-35 heavy tank, which was somewhat mechanically unreliable, and it was also costly to produce. As you might have guessed from our earlier description, well, these tanks, they were effectively designed with a single feature in mind, and that was survivability. Towards this end, the tanks were equipped with exceptionally thick armor. This thickness, it did vary somewhat based on model. For reference, the KV-1 boasted armor that was 90mm thick, that's 3.5 inches on the front, and 70mm thick, that's 2.8 inches on the rear and sides. Now, of course, there is always a trade-off in anything, and the thickness and weight of the KV's armor came at the expense of almost everything else. The tank was slow, had limited maneuverability and firepower relative to what you'd expect from a tank that size, and to top it all off, it had exceptionally poor visibility. In fact, it's noted that Soviet commanders frequently complained about the tank despite the defensive protection that it offered. These sentiments weren't echoed by the German troops who initially encountered this moving shield, though. The KV-1 and KV-2, the two most popular models of the tank, were nearly invincible during initial skirmishes with the Germans, as few anti-tank weapons they possessed could punch a hole through the armor, and even the ones that could required uncomfortably close range to do it. As noted by an unspecified German soldier in a 1949 report compiled by the US Army's Historical Division, there suddenly appeared for the first time a battalion of heavy enemy tanks of previously unknown type. They overran the armored infantry regiment and broke through into the artillery position. The projectiles of all defense weapons, except the 88mm flak, bounced off the thick enemy armor. Our 100 tanks were unable to check the 20 enemy dreadnoughts and suffered losses. Several Czech-built tanks, T-36s, that had bogged down in the grain fields because of mechanical trouble were flattened by the enemy monsters. The same fate befell a 150mm medium howitzer battery, which kept on firing until the last minute, despite the fact that it scored direct hit after direct hit from as close a range as 200 meters. Its heavy shells were unable to put even a single tank out of action. In another account, a German soldier in the 1st Panzer Division noted, "The KV-1 and KV-2 which we first met here were really something. Our companies opened fire at about 800 yards, but they remained ineffective. We moved closer and closer to the enemy, who, for his part, continued to approach us unconcerned. Very soon we were facing each other at 50 to 100 yards. A fantastic exchange of fire took place without any visible German success. The Russian tanks continued to advance, and all armor-piercing shells simply bounced off them. Thus, we were presently faced with the alarming situation of the Russian tanks driving through the ranks of 1st Panzer Regiment towards our own infantry and our hinterland. Our Panzer Regiment therefore turned about and rumbled back with the KV-1s and KV-2s roughly in line with them." The former report also notes that a lone KV tank, the exact model isn't clear, simply parked in the middle of the road, blocking the main supply route, and sat there soaking up anti-tank rounds for several days. To quote, "There were practically no means of eliminating the monster. It was impossible to bypass the tank because of the swampy surrounding terrain." Among the initial armaments brought against the troublesome tank were 4 50mm anti-tank guns. One by one, the tank took them all out, suffering no meaningful damage itself. Frustrated, the Germans commanded a nearby 88mm anti-aircraft gun, positioning it a few hundred feet behind the tank. This is basically point-blank range for a gun that is designed to rip planes in half. While this weapon was capable of piercing the tank's armor at that range, before they could fire, the KV turned the gun's crew into a pink smear. Next up, the Germans decided to send in an engineer crew in the cover of darkness to see if they could take it out up close and personal. While they did manage to get to the KV and attach demolition charges, it turned out they underestimated the needed explosive power, and only a few pieces of the tank's track were destroyed, leaving the tank still fully functional. As for the tank crew themselves, they initially received needed supplies to continue their barrage on the Germans via the cover of night. However, ultimately the Germans were able to cut off supply access to the tank and then sent a whopping 50 of their own tanks in to take it out, or that appeared to be their plan. While the massive number of tanks were approaching and occupying the attention of the KV crew with their limited visibility, the Germans were able to, according to the 1949 account from the unnamed German soldier, set up in camouflage another 88 Ram, flaked the rear of the tank so that this time it was actually able to fire. Of the 12 direct hits, 3 pierced the tank and destroyed it. Of course, all good things must come to an end, and the KV line's many limitations saw it quickly go from a near impervious mobile fortress to a virtual sitting duck, with German forces reacting to it by developing new explosive anti-tank rounds fully capable of taking the KVs out. While still used throughout the war, once this happened, the KVs were largely replaced by the more well-rounded T-34 tank. Still, it's impossible to argue that the KV didn't make one hell of a first impression, even if, ironically enough, it didn't have any staying power. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and do not forget to subscribe for brand new videos just like this every day of the week. Also, I'd like to take this moment to thank our patrons on Patreon. If you're interested in supporting us with a small financial contribution each month and getting some great perks in return, please do consider heading over to patreon.com/TodayIFoundOut. And as always, thank you for watching.